Hi everyone, welcome to our presentation on organic fraud prevention plans. This presentation is part of our TOPS programming. The Transition to Organic Partnership Program is an initiative by the USDA to support the transition to organic through mentorship and educational resources. So to jump in to fraud prevention plans and provide some background on where this requirement comes from. They were introduced in the Strengthening Organic Enforcement rule that took effect earlier this year in 2024. The goal of fraud prevention plans are to help prevent the misrepresentation of conventional product as organic and to help maintain the integrity of organic products. The good news for our certified producers is that there's likely lots of things that they're already doing to help prevent fraud in the supply chain. And now those practices just need to be described as part of their OSP. So here's the regulation that the requirement comes from. 205-201 Organic Production and Handling System Plan. You'll see the bottom highlighted portion reads that this must include a description of monitoring practices and procedures to verify suppliers in the supply chain and organic status of agricultural products received, and to prevent organic fraud as appropriate to the certified operations activities, scope, and complexity. So this is important because it means that fraud prevention plans need to be tailored to the specific farm or operation, and that no two fraud prevention plans will look the same. So what makes up a fraud prevention plan? These elements were spelled out in the preamble of the Strengthening Organic Enforcement ruling. And here are some that would be considered part of a good fraud prevention plan. First of all, a map of your supply chain or a written narrative describing what kinds of things are coming into your system, like seed, animal feed, organic ingredients, those sorts of things. Producers should be able to identify critical control points, which are these potential areas where fraud or commingling / contamination could occur in the supply chain. And then practices for verifying organic status, products, imports, and suppliers in use. So a description of what's done to make sure that the organic products you receive to your farm or operation are in fact organic. And then what's done to mitigate potential risk of fraud at those critical control points that are identified. Monitoring procedures, so what's done to figure out whether what you're doing is effective at mitigating fraud. And then lastly, a description of how a farmer or producer would report suspected fraud to their certifier. So the fraud prevention plan question has been integrated into the OSP for most of our crop and livestock producers. We'll take a look at that in the next slide. A separate fraud prevention plan worksheet was provided to our handlers and some of our more complex crop and livestock farmers. But the fraud prevention plan itself can be in whatever form is most suited to the farmer. So if you want to write it up on a separate sheet of paper and submit it, that would be fine too. So here's a look at the NOFA New York's Crops OSP. So section 16 is the product tracking and fraud prevention plan section. The questions on this slide are all kind of interrelated in terms of tracking and fraud prevention plan. And then we'll see on the next slide the actual fraud prevention plan question. But just to give a quick rundown through these questions, the first one, question A, talking about how lot numbers are used to track products. So this could be on records, planting records, harvest records, um, invoices, incoming and outgoing, those sorts of things. So just a description of how um, crops or products are identified on audit trail paperwork. Question B is related to lot numbers as well, asking how lot numbers or um, I, unique identifiers are used to link non-retail containers to audit trail information. So um, how a non-retail product like a wrapped bale or something, how farmers or producers um, tie that non-retail container to their audit trail documents like invoices or production logs. Question C is just a confirmation that um, audit trail documents will include organic identification so that, so for example, an invoice or receipt that if for organic corn, that it would say organic corn, not just corn. Question D, now we're jumping into some of those monitoring practices and procedures that we talked about on the previous slides. So what's done to, looking for a description of what's done to ensure that incoming organic ingredients like seed, feed, animals even, um, what's done to make sure that the products you're buying are in fact organic. And then lastly on this page, we have just asking for a simple description of a lot number. So you'll see some of the examples down below. Some people use harvest dates, cutting dates, the year number with the crop, um, all sorts of things. So just a description of whatever system is being used. So let's jump to the next slide here. So for our crops OSP, we have this question F in that same section 16 that asks for the fraud prevention plan. And then on the handling OSP, there's a question confirming that producers do in fact have a fraud prevention plan, and then they would submit that on a separate sheet that would be attached to their OSP. So let's jump into some examples of what a fraud prevention plan might actually look like. So here's an example of a supply chain map from OTCO. So this is for a crops producer. So you'll see that in this example, they've identified that the incoming organic thing into their farm are annual seedlings, and that they get them from a domestic supplier, and that they're transported by an uncertified entity to their farm. And you'll see with that lightning bolt here that they've identified both the supplier and the uncertified transport as potential areas where fraud could happen. So the general point of a supply chain map is to illustrate all incoming organic items. Like I said earlier, that the complexity of your fraud prevention plan and the supply chain map depends on the complexity of your operation. Other examples of how this might look for other farmers or producers could be a hand-drawn flowchart, typed out spreadsheet, a more complex illustration, or even just a written narrative would also work. There's no wrong way to provide this information as long as it illustrates what organic items are received by the operation and what's done in the intermediary, such as transport or storage even. So continuing on to what the plan itself might look like for, and in this case, it's a crops example. So we talked about those critical control points earlier, those areas where fraud or misrepresentation could happen. So I liked this example from PCO because it breaks it down to kind of 4 clear steps. So in this example, they've identified seed sourcing as a potential area where there's risk for fraud, um, risk for receiving um, the wrong product, risk for seeds being treated with a prohibitive substance. So what's being done in response to this vulnerability? A farmer might order from um, trusted suppliers. They might purchase from a supplier that only provides organic seeds. They might order early in the seed buying season to make sure that the organic supply doesn't run out. And then what's being done to assess whether those measures are effective? Double checking documentation upon delivery, checking with your certifier to verify if any treatments that seeds might have are in fact compliant before planting them. And then what's being done with it? Number 4, what's being done with any information that comes up during this process? Um, Farmers or producers might have a particular way that they like to document any concerns or problems that they might have with the supplier. Maybe there's a notebook or a document on their computer. They might have employees report to a particular manager or person if they have any concerns about incoming items. And then they also might, if they do have concerns, being sure to keep a copy of those tags or invoices, copies of emails to seed suppliers, those sorts of things. So we're going to jump into a similar example for livestock and then a handler. So here's a similarly constructed supply chain map for a livestock producer, this time with a little more complexity because they're getting in a few different types of things into their farm, bedding, feed, and then organic animals themselves. So they've again identified suppliers as well as transport as potential areas where fraud or misrepresentation could happen. So for the plan itself, for this example from PCO, the critical control point that they've identified, the risk could be receiving ineligible or misrepresented livestock. Measures that a farmer might take to prevent this risk of fraud might be understanding the requirements, regularly training their staff on their requirements, um, having a consistent record keeping system that documents all of the incoming animals and make sure that they're traceable back to the buyer with proof of organic status. And then what's being done to assess whether this is effective, the monitoring and continuous improvement section. It could be double checking paperwork before actually purchasing an animal. It could be performing audits on your record keeping system annually to make sure that it's working properly. And then again, that reporting element, just having a description of the particular way that a farmer plans to report any suspected fraud that might come up or concerns with any animals they buy. And then lastly, a handling example. For I wanted to show this map, especially because they've included uncertified transfer storage in their supply chain map and also importing. So those are great things to represent on your supply chain map or description if they are occurring. And then for the plan portion, um, for this example, the critical control point vulnerability area that they've identified would be importing ingredients. There's a higher risk of fraud um, when that's going on. A lot more product is changes hands many more times, and so there's increased potential for misrepresentation to happen. So there's lots of things that someone might do in response to this vulnerability. Um, on this one, they've mentioned OID a few times, which, if you don't know, is the Organic Integrity Database, which is a online database run by the USDA with all NOP organic certified producers on there. So it's fairly easy to look up a producer to get a copy of their certificate to make sure they're certified um, as they say they are. Um, for the monitoring and continuous improvement portion, someone might run risk audits on the ingredients that they're importing. They could even do residue testing if there's any concerns. And then lastly, the reporting piece. So there might be lots more documentation for imports to save a copy of in case any problems do come up. And again, having a particular way to document any concerns and maybe particular person or way that someone will report fraud to their certifier if they have any concerns. So now we can take a quick look at NOFA New York's Organic Fraud Prevention Plan worksheet. So this worksheet, again, was provided to handlers as well as more complex crop and livestock operations. Um, it does not have, if you received a copy of this, you don't have to submit your fraud prevention plan on this worksheet. You could format it on a separate document that whatever makes more sense for you and your operation. But it could also be a way if you have a drafted plan to kind of walk through and see what gaps might be um, need to be filled in your plan. So got a description up here. Those elements that we talked about earlier are described on here. And then basically uh, walks through kind of the different steps that we talked about earlier. So the supply chain map, the identification of critical control points, um, how you came to the conclusion of where in your supply chain there might be vulnerabilities. And then it goes into uh, the practices for monitoring and preventing fraud. So asking what type of documentation you might look at before purchasing something. And then what's done when you do receive the product. And then um, practices for verifying suppliers themselves. So again, what type of paperwork or measures might be done to ensure that the suppliers you're getting seed or feed or other ingredients from are accurately representing their products as organic. And then here's where the critical control points are addressed again. And then we jump into the monitoring practices and procedures. So um, how are you addressing the effectiveness of all these practices that you're doing when you purchase a product? And then lastly, that question about how you would report fraud if anything came up. And just to end off the presentation, a reminder about our technical assistance helpline at NOFA. You can call this number or email us to talk with an educator. Um, Leave us a voicemail and we'll get back to you if you don't get us. And then also we have a weekly Zoom call from 3 to 4 on Tuesday afternoons every week. Feel free to jump on, bring any questions. It's kind of like an open hour, so you're welcome to come and talk about anything, right? Whether it may be helping develop your fraud prevention plan, help on OSP questions, um, or other farm related help. And thanks for joining us.